so our game of the week was, of course, Alabama and Texas A&M. It was a huge game in Tuscaloosa. We talked about how the model showed that it could possibly be a blowout. I said maybe not so much. Part of what I was thinking in this was, and we didn't really get into it, was the fact that Alabama had played, this would be their 8th game in a row, and A&M was coming off a bye week. So that comes into play a little bit. But also, I just think A&M's too talented of a team to really get blown out. They've got too many weapons, but I'd love to get into this. Just talk about what you saw early on, because we saw Alabama kind of look like they dominated the game, dominated the first half, but they went in at halftime only up 6 points. So talk about that. Get us rolling on this one, Alabama and A&M. Let's do it.
Yeah, this game kind of turned out the way we thought it would in a lot of ways, but the defining point of this game was that, right, one team could run the ball and one team really couldn't. I mean, would you agree with that? I mean, that
I would, with one caveat. What we thought would be a big game, or the potential big game if A&M had a good game running, would be Williams, the freshman who's been really, really lighting it up this year. But turns out Keith Ford had, by Bama standards of defense, at 4.1 yards per carry and 65 yards, Keith Ford was the one that was effective. And that's not normally what you see in Alabama. They usually have trouble with space players, and Keith Ford is not that. He's a big, bruising back. So what little success they had in the run game was there, which I thought was odd. But to your point, by A&M standards, especially for a team that relies on a higher yards per carry average than yards per attempt average, which makes their offense run, they really struggled, and that's why they only ended up with 14 points.
Yeah, no, I don't know that the model actually made the video last week, but we did talk about it. The numbers we predicted for Texas A&M in a per play sense were just freaking dead on. A&M was averaging 6.71 yards per carry and 6.5 yards per attempt going into this, and we said that A&M was projected to have 3.2 yards per carry, 5.3 yards per attempt. As it turns out, they were 3 yards per carry to our predicted 3.2, and they were 5.3 yards per attempt to our predicted 5.3 yards per attempt. So
yeah, I think I think I messaged you about that, and I was like, we're going to be feeling pretty good about ourselves, at least maybe not on the score, but at least in terms of the per play averages, how it played out.
Yeah, so that was pretty well smack on what we expected. Like you said, Ford was a lot more effective. It's interesting to see why. I think it's really because Alabama is not the big bruising physical team they've been. So a little bit of power helps. But I think more than anything, Travion Williams was just too small. The gaps were, if you get a small guy like that and he's got some holes to shoot through, he can make a big play. But he wasn't big enough to run through the basic arm tackles that he was facing with Alabama. And Ford was big enough to at least manage to brush through that first arm and get to the edge or what have you. And then that was crucial. But for the most part, Trevor Knight, 14 of 31, he did not complete 50% of his passes, about 45% passing. The team was, as a whole, only 3 yards per attempt. Trevor Knight only had 1.8. Just not a really effective offense at all. It's actually surprising that they get 14 points, given that sort of numbers with only about 270 yards of total offense. But as we know, they got one off a turnover, and then they had only one sustained drive in the entire game. The real storyline to me was Alabama was not nearly as effective as I thought they would be. We projected A&M to have about 4.2 yards per play. That was dead on. We talked about the fact that when you reduce that number, that you start seeing radical reduction in the ability of the offense to sustain a drive. That was proved to be very accurate. The problem was Alabama did not really move the ball that well consistently. Early on, they just gouged A&M with a run game. I mean, Damien Harris was just killing them. But as the game progressed, they just slowed down more and more. I think there are really two factors to that. One, and it's really hard to say how they went together. The first was Jalen Hurts was, again, not on point. He wasn't in the Tennessee game. He really struggled throwing downfield until about the middle way through the third quarter, not coincidentally when Alabama put that game away. And in this one, he really struggled to connect downfield. 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. You can throw that away a little bit. One of those interceptions is a Hail Mary. The other one was definitely on him, throwing the ball right to a linebacker dropping the coverage. Was he pressured? Sure, but he still drilled a linebacker with the ball. But what I think is more notable is he only had 164 yards, 6.6 yards per attempt. Even for Alabama standards, that's pretty low. And the other factor was Damien Harris is probably the most underrated player right now in the SEC.
Yeah, I'll be honest. It's starting to make me angry. I was really frustrated that Travion Williams wasn't getting the love that I think he deserved, not only coming in this game, but kind of globally from an SEC standpoint, from a yards per carry standpoint. What is amazing to me is yet again we are still talking about Jacobs and Bo Scarborough and ignoring the fact that, and this might be a little sacrilegious, but Damien Harris can do some stuff in the hole and pre-second level that Derrick Henry could not do. And I think it has made the offensive line look better than last year's offensive line, although they might actually be better as well. But he's making a move, 2 yards deep, and maybe another move right before he gets to the second level that's creating an extra 4 or 5 yards of space in these runs that it's on another level. We haven't seen this in a while from a running back at Alabama.
Right. Damien Harris in that game averaged about 7 yards per attempt. Now, a lot of that came early. We'll probably talk about that, or at least touch on it in just a second. But all the other backs and the quarterback Hurts were 4.4 yards per attempt or under. Hurts was the leading rusher in that game, 21 carries for 90 yards. Harris had fewer carries, but he had 128 yards. What's also notable is that Scarborough and Jacobs combined for about the same number of carries as Harris. They had 19, and they averaged about 3.7 yards per carry. So basically, Jake Harris was consistently twice as effective as any other back in the ball game. He did have one 30-yard long, but it really was pretty consistent. The thing I wanted to touch on was it really did kind of coincide, though, with the way the game went. Harris went out of the game, got shaken up, but he got shaken up right at the point where I think A&M was adjusting. Alabama, between the 20s, was unstoppable early, right? I mean, they just marched straight down the field at the beginning of that game. But when they hit the 20-yard line, why did they stall? A lot of people want to say it was finesse, and maybe there was some truth to the fact that they stopped pounding it. But the reason they stopped pounding the rock, in my opinion, is Texas A&M was playing their safeties back. They were not going to let the Alabama's receivers get downfield. A&M has 3 phenomenal safeties, but they don't have very good corners. And if the corners were left on an island with Alabama's receivers, they were going to get burned, and they were going to give up easy touchdown passes. So A&M probably very smartly said, we're going to make Jalen Hurts throw the ball and work it down the field, and we're going to make Alabama consistently move it. There's some truth to the fact that A&M was a lot healthier, particularly at linebacker. Myles Garrett is the first game he's been healthy for a long time. That bye week was huge. Sumlin talked about that from the opening snap, that he had confidence in his team because they were healthy. But I think A&M realized that Hurts just wasn't on point in this game, and they stopped keeping those safeties back. They marched them up right about the time that Harris went out banged up. When he got kind of leveled on an interception by Hurts. Why was there interceptions? Because all of a sudden A&M put a lot of traffic within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage. They realized that Hurts threw an interception because he was starting to get rattled. And from that point on in the ball game, Alabama was running into stacked fronts. Kiffin kept trying to push the ball down the field and kept failing to do so, really. An interesting stat to sort of back up what I'm saying here, by the way, if anybody really doesn't agree with me, Hurts was 15 to 25, 6.6 yards per attempt. Not terrible. 66 QBR. A&M's defense isn't really great. They have great pass rush, but the secondary struggled. But here's the single rub here. O.J. Howard had 8 of the 15 receptions. Jacobs had 1. The receivers only had 6 receptions in the ballgame. Ridley had 4 for 6.8 yards per reception, and Ordarius Stewart had 2 for 57 yards. But one of those was a 45-yarder where he really outplayed the defensive back to go up for the ball on a not overly well-thrown pass. Outside of that one, the longest pass thrown by Hurts was only 21 yards. In the entire game, he managed a 45-yarder and a 21-yarder, and everything else was under 20. So there was no downfield passing game whatsoever in this ball game from Alabama. And, that's something I kind of put a star next to Harris and his number because he happened to go out on that interception from Hurts. And I think that was a turning point with the way A&M played Alabama defensively. And it's hard to say how much of the change was Harris going out injured, because that really was the point at which Alabama's offense stalled, and how much of it I think really was the fact that A&M made an adjustment in that ball game. And I think the bye week, it's also, we talked about this with Ole Miss and Arkansas and several other teams, but I think much like Arkansas, this was Alabama on their 8th game in a row. They're a little beat up and banged up, and I think they really need a bye week to kind of get the receivers and Hurts on the same page, because they're kind of, they peaked there around the Kentucky game, and they're kind of trending back down again.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing what you and I have talked about, I think, every week since week 1 regarding Alabama and their offense. So we only had, I say only, there's only one non-offensive touchdown for Alabama. You take that away, and you're looking at, 26 points. And those limitations, I think, manifested themselves not only in Hurts missing what I saw were some wide open wide receivers for touchdowns. But there's things that aren't in the numbers that don't show up on the scoreboard, like the Stewart pass you talked about. That's a touchdown with a decent throw. And what happened was, okay, he completed a 45-yarder, moved the ball down the field, but that resulted in a missed field goal, so there's no points there. Driving the ball down at will the first few possessions and having to settle for field goals because there are so many limitations in the red zone. And what's particularly interesting about this is Alabama had, I believe, 2 first and goal on the 10. So first and goal on the 4 is a lot different. Your game plan is a whole lot different. You can run the ball there and still have some success. But on the 10, you have to go exactly 10 yards, and you're facing the maximum disadvantage given the relative distance you need to go compared to the short field that the defense has to cover. And it limits Kiffin's playbook there, and it really showed because he didn't have a passer that could take advantage of, some of the things that he had to do. So I think we saw it in this game, but what's really interesting here, just like we talked about last week about how scary Alabama is given the fact that they don't have a lot of production from a throwing quarterback, A&M completely took this away from them and forced him to throw. He wasn't successful doing it, and they still won 33-14.
Yeah, you're hearing this from the media too, so it's not just us. And what we're trying to do is break down a little bit why you're hearing this phrase, and it's Alabama is winning despite the fact that they could get a lot better. Alabama is not playing clean football. Jalen Hurts has a long way to go to where he can be. I think his ceiling's pretty high, but he's not there yet. He's still a very rushed, rough, unpolished passer. It's a lot like Nick Marshall in 2013 versus Nick Marshall in 2014. This is early Nick Marshall. This is Nick Marshall that could complete some big plays down the field, but was very much a run-first player. There is a 2014 Nick Marshall. I know Auburn wasn't as good that year for other reasons, but Nick Marshall could throw the ball in 2014. And Alabama, if Jalen Hurts starts being able to complete these downfield throws, Alabama's offense could actually operate in an entirely higher gear, and that's it's a little bit terrifying that the potential is that high.
So, talking a little bit about what we saw from the defense for Alabama, because we've talked some about the adjustments A&M made, and I think they deserve credit for that because they're really the first team who's done that this year, I think, successfully. I think Alabama could have run for 400 yards against Arkansas or Ole Miss had they wanted to. A&M really adjusted there. But on the defense, so Alabama, a slight correction on your earlier statement. Alabama gave up 2 long drives that combined for, I think, 157 of that 278 yards, which means outside of those 2 drives, A&M did nothing the rest of the game. If you go to ESPN.com, look at the play-by-play, not the box score, but the play-by-play, you see a lot of single-digit and negative numbers for lengths of drives, and that is pretty astonishing given how A&M can play. But if not for some absolutely ridiculous throws, some Sugar Bowl Trevor Knight throws against this Alabama defense, and some ridiculous play from the wide receivers, that's a shutout. Like, they gave up 14 points, and that was because for a little bit of the game, for 2 drives in the game, the A&M receivers and the A&M quarterback were out of their mind.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I mean, that's the style of offense that someone runs once they get in a rhythm, especially once they get you substituting. They can move the ball, but it's going to be interesting to see how well Alabama can keep it up. I think the loss of Eddie Jackson is really substantial. That was Eddie Jackson. May have become the best safety in the conference. Honestly, I mean, he was hit at very, very high level. They do have Tony Brown that's come back from suspension early in the year, but yeah, I mean, Alabama's defense is very effective at all 3 levels. I think their one weakness is depth. If you can start getting first downs and force them to rotate, they lose a lot of pop in the front 7. But, the secondary, the corners are very good. The safeties are very good. The linebackers, those are the best linebackers in the country. I don't know that it's really even close, to be honest.
It's interesting, real quick, on the linebackers, because you and I have talked about Ruben Foster, you even, to your credit, more than me, going back 3 or 4 weeks, and the national media is starting to pick up on it. And in all fairness, they don't see him play as much as we see him play, because we watch every single SEC game every week, if not multiple times. So I think it's fair, because he was a little bit of a late bloomer. There was these early expectations. They didn't materialize till a little bit later. But I think we've gone from a guy who we were like, okay, he's an NFL player, to in just 6 weeks, 7 weeks, oh, he might be a first-round draft pick.
I said after the USC game, and I said this may be blasphemous, but I thought that he was probably the best player at that spot under Nick Saban. I felt like if the Southern Cal game, and I think I texted this to you, to watch in that game, I said if he plays at this level for the rest of the season, he will be the best middle linebacker of the Saban era. And there have been some great ones, Hightower, Mosley, Rolando McClain, were multiple first-round draft picks, and Foster is better than all of them. He is a Pro Bowl linebacker right now, NFL Hall of Famer written all over him. I mean, his biggest issue is staying healthy, but if he stays healthy at the level he's playing at, he does everything, his absolute force against the run, extremely athletic, runs extremely well, plays the pass. We see it every time he's gone out. He went out in the Ole Miss game, and it was a big him and Jackson again. That's kind of a bad omen when Ole Miss came back in that game. I mean, he's an absolute force.
And I think the illustration I gave earlier in the week or yesterday was, to me, he looks like someone who has the physicality of Rolando McClain. If we're talking about former Saban-era linebackers at Alabama, the physicality of Rolando McClain and the IQ of Mosley. Do you think that's a fair comparison?
Yeah. You say IQ, but I think it's just pure athleticism to some degree.
I think, but he's playing with a lot higher football IQ, in my opinion, than he has in the past, and it's I think part of that IQ is the speed at which you play because you're having to read and recognize, and it takes knowing your assignment so well that you play without thinking. And we've seen some linebackers for Alabama in the past, especially because of such a complex scheme under Nick Saban, that have all the tools in the world, but they're a step slow in reacting, or they're a step slow in, pass coverage. But Rolando McClain is shooting gaps like crazy. He's running down, Travion Williams, who's fast and small. And I haven't. The lights starting to come on for me, because I don't know that I agreed with you early in the year, but I think I'm there. From what I've seen, I think he is the best at his position in the Saban era at Alabama.
Yeah, I agree, and I think he is. He's definitely. I think the light bulb came on. I think he's actually a bright kid. I think he just didn't necessarily put in the thought and time he should have early, and there's been some statements from him to that effect. I think he's figured out the defense. He's starting to operate without, like you said, without thinking. And what's amazing to me is that at his size, whatever he is now, about 245. He's probably the second fastest linebacker, only just behind Mosley. And I mean, the difference between him and Trey Priest is pretty. It's pretty stark. So no, I'm totally with you. I mean, he's operating at a very high level.
So talking about the Eddie Jackson injury, which everybody kind of cringed when they saw that, even non-Bama fans, because he's meant so much to this team, and not just in defense, but also in kick returns. But I'm looking at their schedule. I'm not saying this to minimize his impact on the team, but more as a reflection of how deep Alabama is and the teams they're going to play. I don't know that there's a team left on their schedule, including the SEC championship game, that can actually take advantage and exploit his absence. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I may agree with you. There's been a lot of SEC teams that had front-loaded schedules. We talked about Auburn with the passing teams they'll play. Alabama's pretty similar. There really isn't another true passing team left on their schedule. It's LSU, Mississippi State, Auburn. All three of those teams are run first. LSU and Auburn almost excessively so. And who are they going to play in the SEC championship? Well, they could play Tennessee again, and
they're going to play Florida.
Yeah, but it's starting to look like it's going to be Florida if Florida can beat. I mean, the Florida LSU game is going to be pretty pivotal. But regardless, we're not necessarily going to see an elite passer in that game either. So, I think it'll be the playoffs before Alabama plays a passing game. And I haven't heard, how long he's supposed to be out. I've heard broken leg, but conceivably that could be back by the playoffs, right?
Could be, especially given the long gap. But he might be shaking some cobwebs off. And we saw what Eddie Jackson shaking off leg injury cobwebs look like against Auburn a couple of years ago, where he was giving up Bomb City, which led to him being a safety and not a corner anymore. But look, these teams, even that they know that Alabama's missing a guy that's very important to that defense, aren't going to change their offense to try to take advantage of it. Because when you do stuff like that, you start making mistakes, because you're doing your early season Auburn, right? Like, that's not your game. You're playing something that's not your identity, only to take advantage of a weakness. It's not going to happen. So we're not going to see a bunch of 5 wides from LSU and Auburn to get into that, third and fourth safety for Alabama, a lot of dime looks from Alabama to where they can really exploit some depth issues. I don't see it happening, and I don't think even if they try to do that, that they've got a quarterback that can pull it off.
No, I'd agree with that. I mean, it's just there's nobody left that's going to really be able to do that, probably until the playoffs. And even then, you can start questioning whether any of the playoff teams this year are maybe Clemson, but how many of them are really equipped to do it either?
Yeah, I think the only one would probably be Washington. But speaking of playoff teams, I don't know if you noticed, there's a team in Ohio that was pretty highly rated that some had even said, like Alabama, could hang with an NFL team, which is weird given that they played Wisconsin to overtime the week before. But Ohio State, not sure if you heard it, they lost this weekend to an unranked team. So if you did hear about it, maybe you saw it, and you can tell us about what happened.
Yeah, it did actually. I watched the start of that game, I guess the first third of it. watched the second, third. I've actually been out of town, and I just watched the rest of the game on the in-flight entertainment, of course, because the Wi-Fi was broken on the plane. Gotta love flying. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. We've talked about it privately. I don't know how much we've really talked about it on the show, but I always felt like Ohio State was a team that was going to struggle the moment they faced anyone that could really stop the run. We felt like the Ohio State-Wisconsin game could be interesting for that reason. The same way that Wisconsin beat LSU was because Wisconsin was first and foremost a team that could stop the run and they could run the ball. And, they really made Ohio State struggle for the same reasons, even though Wisconsin isn't really that great all around. Penn State is another team in the Big Ten that can stop the run. I mean, the Big Ten is living up to the cliche. It's slow, big boy football, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, and you got to give them some credit for it. They've got some really good run defenses. And, Penn State held Ohio State to 4.2 yards per carry. J.T. Barrett, for all the love he gets, he isn't a real great downfield passer. I mean, he runs that Meyer spread zone read offense real well, but he isn't, he's not going to be Cardell Jones. I don't think Ohio State beats Alabama in 2014 with J.T. Barrett at quarterback. They beat him because they had a guy that could really throw it down the field. And here, Penn State is too disciplined and too good defensively for you to try to nickel him, dime him down the field. J.T. Barrett ends up, we see this over and over and over again. I know I repeat the word 3 times because it deserves it. J.T. Barrett had 17 carries. He's the second leading rusher in that game behind Weber at 21. Almost as many carries as the starting tailback. And he had 1.5 yards per carry. And drug down, the per carry average in that game is really screwed up because it says 4.2 yards per carry. Yeah, that's because Curtis Samuel, the receiver, had 2 35-yard carries. Or had a... So, in truth, the running backs only had 3.4. The quarterback had 1.5. And then the quarterback throwing the ball only had 5.7. So it's actually almost surprising that they managed 21 points. Most of that came off, again, Curtis Samuel had a touchdown on one of his end arounds. And then they had some, Penn State actually turned the ball over a number of times in that ball game. But, all Penn State did offensively, Saquon Barkley managed 8.3 yards per carry. Bizarrely, do we need to put up a billboard in all the major cities telling people, running backs are there to run, quarterbacks are there to throw? Saquon Barkley had 12 carries for 99 yards, and Trace McSorley, the not all that athletic but can run somewhat quarterback, had 19 carries, 50% more than Saquon Barkley for 3.3 yards per carry. So, I understand why you'd want your All-American running back to only get the ball 12 times in a ball game. I mean, that seems like a great idea. And it's not like there were any other backs, by the way, that got any carries in that ball game. That was it. It was just they only gave 12 carries to the running back. Penn State only ran 60 plays in that game. So to 83 by Ohio State, which is kind of weird too. Obviously there was some weirdness at the end of the game with a blocked field goal that gets returned for a touchdown. So that generated free points. But, we talk about this a lot. Anytime you get in a game where the margins get really small, scoring does not necessarily track with yardage, and we do the best we can given expectations. But if you're in a game where anything below really 25 points, stuff gets weird because maybe this one catch maybe the guy catches the ball in the 75-yard pass and you score and then you win the game, and maybe he tips it and you don't. But it ends up being these tiny little differences in games like this that end up deciding it. And if you can't generate enough offense for basically the statistical average to come up, I think we've talked in the past about dice rolls, right? It's if I roll a dice 3 times and I say I need to average a 3, so I need to get a total of 9. If I only roll it 3 times, there's a distinct chance I won't make 9. But if I roll that dice 20 times, odds are that I will have a 4 to a 6, at least as much as a 1 to a 3. And if I roll that dice 20 times, the odds of me averaging more than a 3 are very high. But if you can't generate enough offense, it's like you don't get many dice rolls. and sometimes you get a weird result. This is one of those weird results, but again, it wasn't that surprising because Ohio State really all they could do all year was run the football against a lot of teams in the Big Ten that are very terrible. Cough, cough, Indiana. That's enough to blow them out. That's going to blow out Rutgers. But when you play somebody like Penn State or Wisconsin that went to overtime that can actually stop the run, you're going to struggle. And you know what? It's entirely conceivable that Ohio State drops a couple more. Nebraska's looking like a pretty darn good football team. And Michigan is a very good football team. And so this may end up being a 3-loss to Ohio State, which is probably what most of us thought they would be to start with. I think it was just, we said very early this year in the National Outlook, Oklahoma was probably greatly overrated. Ohio State beat Oklahoma and nobody else, and way too much was made out of Ohio State off that win.
So it's funny because this game very much looked like the game Ohio State lost last year against Michigan State. It's a team that plays good defense that can force you to throw it and you can't execute. And then you get into the fourth quarter and it's tight, and kind of like you were saying, anything can happen then. It really, as you approach zero on the scoreboard, you neutralize your advantages that you have when you're a more talented team. Tell me if this sounds accurate to you when describing Ohio State on the offensive side of the ball, because I think Alabama is a better team defensively than Ohio State, even though I think Ohio State's a decent defensive team. To me, Ohio State offensively has very similar quarterback problems with a throwing quarterback, or a quarterback who can run but has some struggles throwing it. But where Alabama has an offensive coordinator that can get creative and hide and work around some of that and generate points, Ohio State lacks it.
I think there's some truth to it. It is interesting because I think you're right. I think there are a lot of similarities between the two. I will divulge from that a little bit. JT Barrett is very effective in the short to intermediate passing game. He makes good reads. He delivers inaccurate football. But JT Barrett struggles to throw the ball down the field. I think Hurts is probably a much better quarterback in terms of just sheer arm strength. So that gives you an element of verticality that I think Ohio State doesn't have. But there are a couple big differences in these two teams. One, Alabama has a powerful offensive line that's got some experience, and they've got a bunch of really powerful running backs. And I think they have that a little bit more of an edge to, Ohio State can generate a lot of rushing yardage, but they've generally done it more by getting to the perimeter and outrunning you more than just running you over, which is what Alabama's been doing. But I think the biggest difference is Alabama has a freaky set of receivers. And when all else breaks down, like that Stewart play against A&M, and I think it was amazing how quiet as they were in the Texas A&M game. Alabama's receivers can take over a game. And, the USC game was the Alabama receiving corps that really provided a spark. And it's varied who does it game to game. But I don't know that, they have Curtis Samuel and they managed to get him involved in the sweep. But Ohio State doesn't have that overall talent at receiver, I think, to help out a quarterback that struggles a little bit. But, I do agree that they're pretty similar in terms of the fact that they both have running quarterbacks and the same sort of limitations. And I think you're also right that, maybe where Alabama's been a little creative, and I know Alabama fans hate to see a finesse offense. I note, of course, that Alabama's touchdowns against A&M in the red zone were all passing touchdowns. But, that creativity, I think it's the difference between what, Ohio State was that monster 2 years ago when they won the championship, and then they just kind of sputtered all last season.
Well, they had
right.
Herman.
And it was Herman and his creativity, and you're seeing how much that meant to that offense once they don't have it.
So we go from a defensive struggle to I don't even think it's fair to utter the word defense in association with this game. We want to touch on it real quick just because it was that bad. And it just merits a little bit of discussion. And I know you said that we don't have a whole lot of time to talk about stats in this game, but I'm going to do it anyway because 66-59 Oklahoma Texas Tech was an absolute insult to college football fans everywhere. Both exactly 854 yards apiece. But you got to be frustrated when you're a Texas Tech quarterback. You put up 734 yards passing, 85 yards rushing, 7 total touchdowns, only 1 turnover, and you lose the game. Like I heard another podcast earlier this week talking about, like, maybe just hold your opponents to 50. Just hold them to 50, and you're going to have a lot of wins. And that is sad, really sad. So maybe not going to talk a whole lot about numbers, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about this game, what we saw, what does it all mean? I got to know.
Yeah, no, I really, you gotta be proud of Oklahoma for finding a way to win this one. I just sort of channel my inner Mac Brown here. And they really fought to the end of the game, and it was hard fought. And, these defenses started getting tired, but Oklahoma just found a way to win. No, 66 points. 66 points, and you win by a score, 66-59. I mean, I was watching this ticker go back and forth with breaking in, and it's like, oh, yeah, Oklahoma's up 2 scores. Oh, they're up 1 score. Oh, they're 2. Oh, they're 1. And I realized, yeah, they went drive after drive where they never stopped each other from scoring. Good freaking Lord. I mean, how many times, do you know how many non-touchdown drives there were in the second half?
I doubt there were many. I would say 0.
There was 1.
Okay, 1.
But Texas Tech went 3 and out the first drive of the second half, and that lost them the ball game. They scored every other drive. For 8? There were 11 touchdown drives in the second half in a row. I mean, what the crap? It just and if you're Patrick Mahomes, Oklahoma was so effective it actually limited their play total. Alabama had that problem against Arkansas, talking about teams without a good defense, right? Where they had, like, every other play was going for 70 yards from their defense, went right back on the field. Oklahoma kind of wore themselves down, and the reason is their stats were just gaudy. Mayfield was averaging 15.1 yards per attempt. Mixon averaged 8.5 yards per carry on 31 carries. So that's a lot of carries to have that high of an average. 7.7 yards per attempt for the whole team, including sacks. But they ran 76 plays, which is a pretty standard number. Texas Tech, they ran 109 plays in this game. And like you talked about, Mahomes, passing and rushing, was responsible for 100 plays. 80 freaking 8 pass attempts. And he was the leading rusher with 12 carries. There were only 9 carries. Well, one of them, that's not even true, because one of them was actually was an intentional grounding. So there were only actually 8 carries by a running back in this ballgame for a total of 36 yards. And the other, 119 yards that Texas Tech amassed was from Patrick Mahomes. So if, I don't know how irate he is to have accounted personally for 819 yards in a ball game and lose, but
okay, so I know you got the stats up. Try not to look. If you already know, you can tell me. But if you don't know, I'd love for you to guess how many first downs combined were in this game.
Oh no, that's an interesting one. Yeah, I don't know that answer. I do know. Well, I know they both had about 850 yards of offense.
They both had exactly 854 yards of offense.
So, gosh, if you were to break it down into tens, it'd be 85 each. But that's just silly and stupid. I'm gonna guess 60 first downs total.
76 first downs.
That's
34 for Oklahoma and 42 for Texas Tech. And the thing that's so funny about that is, to what you were saying earlier, they didn't get that many first downs because you had, or as many as they could, because you had plays of 50, 56, 46. I'm breathless talking about how bad this is. Oklahoma only had 10 third down attempts. They were 6 of 10 on third down. Texas Tech was 20 of 25. 76 first downs, y'all. It's hard to put into words what that means in terms of how bad the defenses are, especially considering both of these teams have had games where they didn't light it up. I mean, what did West Virginia held Texas Tech to 17 points? And, we saw Oklahoma put up, what was it, 24, but not even that great against Ohio State, and 23 against Houston. So these aren't just great offenses. These are really, really bad defenses.
Yeah, it's comical. You get two defenses, and there's so much of this, right? I can sort of excuse Oklahoma with 109 plays. You do get worn down, right? At the end of the game, if you've played that much, you often see a defense just give up everything. But Oklahoma, it's not like Oklahoma ran a ton of plays. They only ran 76. Texas Tech just never stopped them ever. They weren't even on the field long enough to get tired. It just horrid defense. Over 1,200 yards passing in this ball game, and that's not counting the 420 rushing. Just burn it. Just burn it all. The Big 12, they didn't want to expand, and I think that's good, because at this point I think they're going to be classified as some sort of disease from the Center of Disease Control there in Atlanta, and not allowed into the Southeast any longer.
It's crazy. I mean, there's really there's no words to put into, to say just how bad this was. And y'all, I think we're going to end our review show on that. And I'm sorry, I apologize if you are gonna have some nightmares until we can get our preview show up. But that was it. 59-66. And like you, I kept watching that score on the ticker, and I kept looking for the overtime little sign, and I never saw it. No, that was regulation. So really, really good review show this week. Take a look. I think probably Wednesday we'll have our preview show up. Thanks for listening, y'all, and we'll see you next time.